Coming in. My name is Jay Pilliard. I'm the energy coordinator for the town of Moretown, and on the behalf.
So I've been giving presentations on this topic for a couple of years, and I usually give a pretty long presentation. I usually take about an hour and a half, and I take questions throughout the whole thing. And that's one thing that stretches it out. Tonight, I'm not going to do that because we're going to try to focus most of the discussion in the panel afterwards. So I'm going to move through what I've got here relatively quickly and try to hit the main points and not go down into too much of the weeds. We'll leave that to later, to basically allow people to just go where they will with these topics. I bring a certain perspective to this. It's a perspective based on sort of big picture. I'm very interested in how society is going to sort out different renewable energy resources and really try to make a quick transition to renewables. I am a hardcore believer in the threat of climate change. I have been since about the early 90s. I used to work in a national laboratory which had a geophysics institute, and I got a good introduction in about 1994, 93 to what was happening with carbon dioxide concentrations. And so ever since then, I've been working a lot on energy and been involved with renewable energy. So I just want to give you some idea of where I'm coming from. I'm not going to get into the climate issue now, just to tell you where my background is. I got very involved in teaching about, researching, working with renewable energy systems in New Mexico, and I eventually got involved in policy advocacy, and I really worked that very hard for over a decade. And the group that I put together and I were able to get through many different incentives for both renewables and efficiency. Mostly mentioned the renewable stuff here. So I have a lot of background in policy development, and we were actually very successful. I was a very strong advocate of utility scale wind in that state. This is a photo of at the ribbon cutting of the first project that was installed in New Mexico based on the policies that we got out. This was a 205 megawatt utility scale wind farm in the eastern plains of New Mexico. And I'm the guy in the strange hat on the right. What I want to do is sort of set the stage by talking about this idea of trying to really compare renewable energy options. My perspective on this is that reducing CO2 or other greenhouse gas emissions significantly is a really daunting task. And I think that our chances of really reducing quickly enough to stave off the worst ravages. I really emphasize that we really need to look very carefully at the technologies. Basically, renewable energy technologies are not created equal. There are lots of differences. There are enormous differences in the potential of different renewable resources, in their cost and cost trends, in their prospects for being improved further, and in their environmental impacts. So from my perspective, if we're really going to succeed in bringing about a rather enormous change to society and to our energy infrastructure pretty rapidly, we're going to have to look at these kind of things very carefully. We're going to have to make our choices very carefully. And what I perceive widely is that there tends to be, within the advocacy community, within the renewable energy industry, with the utility industry, and with quite a few members of the public at large, is sort of an any and all approach, which is we'll just take all of it. Any project we can get off the ground, any kind of development, we've got to do anything, everything we can do is helpful for this. And I actually have the opposite view. I think that that's a very problematic type of approach. I think we need to look very carefully at this, and that this kind of any and all approach is arguably harmful. So whether or not you agree with me on wind and some other topics that I'll discuss tonight, I would hope that maybe at least that we could agree on that would be something that we could get going as a little more of a serious discussion. The first thing I thought I would talk about on wind is just to take a little look at the kinds of impacts associated with it. The impacts have been sharply downplayed by the industry and by advocates of wind. After many, many years of interacting with this industry and actual projects, I've come around to the point of view that the impacts are actually very serious, and they're particularly serious in the Northeast. There are topographical impacts to the land, blasting and bulldozing, and then associated with those, hydrological impacts that come from creating large impervious surfaces up on mountaintops. There is a significant amount of habitat fragmentation and loss. In Vermont, the one place we've left quite pristine is our mountain ranges. That's where much of our wildlife lives. We've inhabited the valleys quite fully, and building fairly large roads and large projects down mountain ridges really does result in a lot of habitat issues. There are potential impacts to birds and bats. These are sharply downplayed by the industry, but from my point of view, if we really try to develop a lot of this stuff, those impacts become potentially very, very serious. There are impacts to people. There are issues with noise. When I was first advocating in this area, I used to downplay the noise issue. I really believed that noise was an insignificant issue. I have come to a different point of view, especially for people that live relatively close to the projects. And also there are issues, unexplored issues actually, with noise impacts on wildlife. There are some people looking into this now, but not that many. The issue of aesthetic impacts also is very relevant in Vermont. Much of Vermont's economy depends on the aesthetics here. Many people live here because they like the aesthetics. They sacrifice a lot to enjoy those. There is, directly or indirectly, much of our economy here depends on ecotourism, and the aesthetics are often considered a shallow issue. People who are concerned about aesthetic impacts are often labeled as NIMBYs, not in my backyarders, and sort of denigrated for that. I sort of have the opposite view on that. I think that when people really value the way the landscape looks, that translates later on into strong environmental valuing and strong environmental protections like Act 250 and things like that. If you take that away, I think the entire ecological protection network that exists in a place like this starts to collapse. We've seen that happen in places like West Virginia, and we don't want it to happen here, I believe. Then there are the impacts that happen to communities. These projects, large-scale wind projects on ridge lines, as a rule, tend to be extremely controversial and divisive. We've seen that over and over in Vermont. A lot of issues associated with that. And then from a larger standpoint, all of these issues and how they play into decisions we make, how they play into how public acceptance of renewable energy evolves over time, is a very serious issue, and there are lots of implications possibly for the effectiveness and public support for renewable energy. If we really alienate a large fraction of the public, even just 5–10%, that can be enough to shift the entire political support for renewables to a minority position and possibly undermine the whole endeavor. All right, some more details on the topographical impacts. One thing people need to understand is these are very large devices. They require a great deal of steel in their support tower, a great deal of cement. They're very heavy, large objects. These things cannot be installed kind of just nestled in among the trees. Installing them is a major kind of undertaking. Moving these things up there require very large trucks and cranes, and the sites have to be cleared and made ready for those vehicles on a permanent basis so that you can do this kind of construction. The physics just doesn't work unless you do that. So you need what I would call industrial strength roads. Sometimes people talk about, well, we've got logging here, we've got logging roads. The kind of roads that we're talking about here are a whole different scale. They're closer to interstate highways in terms of their level of support and width and whatnot. And so this translates into lots of bulldozing and blasting. So here are some photos. The picture on the left shows a typical carrying a tower. These things have a lot of trouble, sometimes even getting up fairly narrow grade or fairly shallow grades. And this is a typical turbine installation site. Here they're pouring the cement foundation, and you can get some sense of the scale looking at the front loader and the vehicle here. These are typically several hundred feet across and with dramatic changes to the landscape. This is one of the first photos I saw of this, which was one of the reasons I started to get concerned about this. This is a site in Mars Hill where they've essentially collapsed a good fraction of the mountaintop just to make a single platform for a wind turbine. To get a sense of scale of that, you can see the little, I think that's a porta potty right about there. Well, these are fairly large trees. This is not minor alteration to the landscape. This is big scale stuff. This is at the Lowell Wind Project, or the King Community Wind Project near Lowell. Here they've done the opposite. Instead of collapsing part of the mountainside, they've filled it in. They brought in thousands of truckloads of fill in this project and created these enormous platforms. And along with the platforms come the roads. The roads have to be quite level and very even grade and capable of handling very, very heavy trucks and fairly straight. So this is up the side of Lowell, and you can see that a lot of cutting. As I said before, this is more interstate highway type scale. This really reminds me more of I-91 than it does of a logging road. This is up on the top of Lowell. Get some sense of scale. You can see a person standing off to the right here. They blast off large areas and flatten it out. This is at Sheffield, which is another wind project up in the Northeast Kingdom nearby. This is in Massachusetts. Off in the distance there you can see a similar type of thing. So these large alterations to the landscape are not unusual. It's not just a project here and there that does this. It's most ridgeline projects have this kind of thing. This project I think is down south somewhere. I don't know the name of this one. Oh, it is West Virginia. Okay. So, from the hydrological impact side, I think many people are not that aware that the mountaintops, even up on the tops, there are a lot of hydrological features that are quite sensitive. There are a lot of sort of small wetlands and other features, headwaters, whatnot, that are important for streams. These are some pictures at 4 different wind sites in Vermont. Showing, I think, mostly beforehand, in some cases nearby. Standing water, a lot of areas where water can soak down into the ground. And I think Andre is, if he's here, are you here, Andre? So what? You're standing in for him today? Okay, so maybe you could talk about some of those later on in the panel discussion. On birds and bats. The wind industry tries to deflect concern about birds and bats by saying things like cars, power lines, windows kill hundreds of millions of birds and many, many more birds than wind turbines kill. My problem with this kind of approach is that we're basically on a migratory pathway here. The ridges are routinely used by raptors due to the thermals and due to the geographical location that we have here. If it may be the case that if we built extensive wind development in Vermont, we might not have a huge impact on the global population of, say, red-tailed hawk. But we potentially would have a significant impact on those kinds of species, especially raptors, in this area. And those could have consequent ecological impacts that could be fairly significant. 1 or 2 projects here and there aren't going to make that much of a difference, but if we have hundreds of miles of projects, and that's really what's being proposed here ultimately, then we could really have a serious issue with that. And the Agency of Natural Resources does recognize that to some extent. They do look at this. So far they've been fairly supportive of wind projects, but I think when we get into really massive scale development, this issue is going to become much more serious, especially now that we have bald eagles in the state. Bats. We do have endangered species of bats living in the area. Bats are pretty suppressed right now in population due to white nose syndrome. But if they transcend that, and then we build hundreds of miles of wind development in the area, we really could see significant issues with bats. It's known very well now that bats can be killed merely by flying near turbines. There have been some ridgeline projects in the United States that happen to have a lot of bats nearby and that have shown very significant bat kill rates, to the point where those projects have had to be curtailed. Now at this point, one thing I'm going to get into briefly later on is the fact that the so-called capacity factors of projects in this site, in this area, don't look very good. The wind resources here, even on the mountaintops, turn out not to be very good. In response to that, the industry, for example, the Lowell project is tending to use now larger blades, longer blades, with a larger swept area that can function more, that can extract more from the site, and that can run when wind speeds are lower. But this is exactly counter to the notion of having to maybe curtail these projects at low wind speeds. And if you really are to curtail a lot for bats, you may be able to protect a lot of bats, but you're going to really cut into the economics and the production from these sites. So that brings their economics more into question. Noise issues, there are a couple of different categories of noise issues. There's audible noise issues. These things do produce audible noise. We have a pretty good idea now of annoyance levels versus decibel levels for wind projects. And putting wind projects on mountaintops where there is a lot of line of sight connection potentially with homes and towns, and on mountains that really aren't all that high and all that far away from residences is really potentially problematic. And we have lots and lots of noise complaints now from the Lowell project and the Sheffield project, for example. There's also an issue people refer to as infrasonic or low frequency noise. This is being sharply downplayed by the wind industry. They're saying there's no evidence of any health effects from low frequency noise. I suspect from looking at what scientific literature there is on this topic that they're wrong. I think there could be a really serious issue here, and there is a lot of anecdotal evidence that people who live close to projects within a mile or so, maybe even 2 miles, suffer serious potential impacts. And basically the idea here is that when you have a very large turbine, you can get a very large, see, I guess I didn't have that, I cut that slide. You can get a very high level of very low frequency noise, which is kind of a shaking. It's a low frequency shaking. You can't hear it, but it can couple to your inner ear quite easily. That's what the research seems to show. And that can affect your sense of balance, potentially causing nausea, sleeplessness, other things like that. Kind of similar to what people call sick building syndrome in some buildings that have badly installed HVAC. So I think this is an emerging issue, and it may be kind of akin to the reluctance of the cigarette industry to admit the impacts of nicotine. Property values, this is another topic that the industry really says doesn't matter. They say that studies show that there are very little impact on property values. I think many of the earlier studies on this topic were simply flawed. There are counter studies now, more and more, suggesting that they will. And personally, I take it just kind of as a no-brainer that in Vermont, a place that is exceptionally valued for its scenic landscape, you put something that's, you put 400-foot high spinning towers, spinning windmills up on, covering large areas of ridgeline that I think it's going to have a really dramatic impact on the aesthetics, and that's going to translate into dramatic impacts on property values eventually. It seems to me there's no way around that. I want to get through a little bit of comparison now. For reasons that will become apparent here, I think we have some much better alternatives to wind in this general region in the Northeast. And to make some of these points, I'm going to step through some data that comes from the National Renewable Energy Lab. This is the best data sets I know of, the most comprehensive, technically strong, fairly objective. And I'm going to look at things from both a local and a regional and a national perspective to try to create a little more context to all this. One resource that much of my data that I'll show here is based on is this GIS-based study of renewable energy potentials that NREL has published a few years ago. This is the culmination of decades of work. Basic fact about wind energy. The power output of a wind turbine is basically proportional to the wind speed cubed to the raised to the third power. This just comes from the basic physics of it. Kinetic energy goes as 1/2 times the mass density times the speed squared. That's a measure of how much energy there is in a block of wind, or a cube of wind, and then you need to examine how rapidly those blocks of energy are delivered to a turbine. You multiply by another factor of V, and you get V cubed. This is a very interesting function here, V cubed. Basically, it's extremely small at low wind speeds, and it's extremely large at high wind speeds. And what this means is basically you need very high wind speeds to get significant wind energy generation. This is a power curve from some actual GE wind turbines, and you can see the same kind of shape here, although this doesn't go all the way to 0. So this has some big implications, and the biggest implication, the simplest one, is that there are very few places, really, relatively, where you have very good wind that could be commercially viable. The Midwestern United States has enormous wind resources here, and this is the dark purple colored stuff. The area that I was helping to develop was out here on the eastern plains of New Mexico, that little pocket there. This is gargantuan. The Western United States has pockets, some pretty good pockets, so you can call it sort of a moderate wind resource overall. And the Eastern United States as a whole has almost nothing. It's incredibly small, except for some of the ridges up in the northeast. The Eastern United States, east of the Mississippi, is largely devoid of commercially viable wind resources. Here are the actual numbers. These are the top 10 states, all in the Southwest and Midwest. These are huge numbers. These are gigawatts. This is billions of watts of potential peak generation. This is what NREL estimates is actually developable in those regions. And this is what NREL estimates is actually developable in the best states in the eastern United States. 26 gigawatts in New York, and then it goes down from there. This is tiny stuff from a large scale perspective. You can see the reason for this. You compare just Iowa to Vermont. A big two-dimensional wind resource out here. Tiny little wind resource here stretching down the ridges. Then the other thing we need to consider, not just the resource in terms of average wind speed, but what is known as capacity factor. This is a measure of how much energy is really produced at a site. It's not. And basically, you just simply take the actual energy you produce and divide it by the energy you would produce if you ran. And it's generally accepted in higher than 30%. It looks like projects are turning out to have capacity factors in and around the 20 to 25% range. That's not good at all. And almost as a rule, the developers project. They typically project 30 to 35%, something in that range. And then it turns out, from what we can tell, the projects don't really seem to produce that way. Here's a whole listing of wind projects in New York State, for example, looking at comprehensively 2 years worth of data. GMP actually publicly admitted their Searsburg project is down in this range. Okay, now going back to those numbers, if we take all of what NREL thinks is viable wind resource, add it up, it comes up to be about 51 gigawatts, 50% of which is in New York. And we can start to, whoops, I should say 51 instead of 52. If we multiply that by the capacity factor, we get about 15 gigawatts. That's really what it's can be effectively rated at. Current US average consumption is about 470 gigawatts. So if we take all of that wind potential in the eastern United States and compare it to the national scale, we get a very small number. It's about 3%. It could produce about 3% of the nation's energy. I'll drill it down to a more regional point of view in a second. It's about 7% of the entire eastern United States demand. All right, now, the real potential is probably a lot less than that, and I'll mention why. These NREL estimates are actually gross upper bounds. They do not take into account all sorts of environmental factors and topographical factors and other things that really affect whether a project can be built. The true number for the Northeast is probably somewhere down in this range, 2 to 10 gigawatts. Maybe 5 as being the number that people seem to really talk about, the industry really talks about doing. So really, there is really not any evidence to suggest that the real potential of wind power in the eastern United States or in the Northeast is really much greater than that. It might be a little bit greater than that, but that there's no real support for that. So we just get a sense of scale here. This is a picture of the areas served by the New York ISO and ISO New England. These show some graphs of the sort of daily demand profile for these giant areas. And you can see here in the New York system, it peaks out at about 40,000 megawatts. That's about 40 gigawatts, about 28 gigawatts here in the Eastern ISO. And with these numbers and with other numbers, you can sort of get some idea of what we could really do here. So let's ask ourselves, suppose we had that 5 gigawatts, say in Vermont and New Hampshire. First of all, this is going to require 333 miles at least of wind development. That's basically stretching from the top of Vermont all the way down to the bottom continuously and back up. And that's assuming the largest turbines available that people are installing here spaced 5 to a mile. It's a very, very dense kind of development. Realistically, maybe you need twice the length of that. Here's that. This is what that would supply. So on a peak level, that would be just 2.2% of the current peak demand. If you look at the total energy consumption, annual energy consumption, it's a little bit less than 5% of that. And it's less than about 2% of the total demand in the Northeast. So these are small numbers. So I just conclude from that, from an analytical standpoint, ridgeline wind in particular is not a significant renewable energy resource for the region. It just isn't. It's a minor source, even despite the size of the turbines and potentially using hundreds or thousands of miles of ridgeline. And supplying even a small fraction. When I look at those pictures of the kind of development that is required here, what I see is that just getting to those small percentages would incur really enormous impacts to the area. I think that's inescapable. So that begs the question, what else are we going to do? What are the better alternatives? Often when I give this talk, somebody will stand up in the back and say, well, what about climate change? And they're right, that we have to address that. This is a chart of the solar energy resource in Vermont. Actually, this is for Montpelier. Amazingly, solar energy is a pretty good resource here. When I first moved here from New Mexico, I was pretty skeptical of that, and I started collecting data on systems and studying it, but I'm now convinced it's probably the best source we've got. It's a little weak down here in November and December, October, but still not completely terrible. The study that I showed you earlier from NREL lists capacity factors for Vermont and for Arizona, for example, and you can divide those, and what you find, and I've verified this in practice, you can produce from a project, a solar project in Vermont, nearly 70% as much as the same project will produce in Arizona. That's pretty good. If it was 20%, 30%, I'd probably say we need to do something else maybe, but that's not half bad. We have people here that live off of solar power. The scale of the solar resource is also just incredibly enormous. It's mainly because it's ubiquitous, it's around everywhere, and also because the technology we mainly use here, photovoltaics, is completely scalable. So you have small scale stuff like rooftops. I like this one because I think it probably would shed snow pretty well. It's an under-addressed issue maybe for PV installations in Vermont. There's another small-scale pole-mounted systems. These are even better because you can tilt them up more and shed snow even better and get better production in the wintertime. We've seen projects like this, small commercial scale. This is you probably recognize that. Anyone know what that is? That's Yestermorrow that are down there on Route 100. And quite a few of these projects in Vermont. These are trackers that track the sun. Pretty effective technology. And utility scale, this is up near, actually at the Burlington Airport. There are issues with this. There are certainly aesthetic issues. There are potentially groundwater, stormwater runoff issues. We have to be careful with these kind of projects too. If we do these wrong, we could potentially cause a lot of resistance, unnecessary resistance, and lack of support for this stuff too. So there's a lot of the same comments that I made about wind do apply to solar, maybe in a little weaker form. All right, going back, shift there, strange. Going back to that NREL study, that GIS study, that GIS study contains very detailed results, state by state, for what NREL considers to be the developable potential for solar in the Northeast. The gross number of gigawatts is enormous, 2,500 gigawatts of potentially developable solar potential. What they did was did a thorough GIS analysis of the Northeast, identify sites according to various criteria, rule out a lot of sites. I'm sure that this is somewhat of a gross upper estimate as well, but I think it's probably less of a gross upper estimate than, more of this, a larger fraction of this is probably developable than the wind one. Let's drill down here and look at Vermont. So what they estimate for Vermont is that there's about 1 gigawatt of peak rooftop potential. At peak, that would be quite a bit more than even the Yankee nuclear plant puts out. About 1 gigawatt of urban potential. This is defined as utility scale projects, smaller utility scale projects that are less than 18,000 square feet in urban boundaries. And then in rural areas, upwards of 35 gigawatts of potentially developable solar. And that's ruling out actually a great deal of land, farmland, and other places that wouldn't be suitable. So that's enormous. This dwarfs the entire wind energy likely developable wind energy potential for the entire eastern United States. And as it says here, even just the rooftop potential significantly exceeds the onshore wind resource. So this is really just from this perspective, this is really our big renewable energy resource. If we're going to really do something, it's probably the right one to look at. Economics issues, so a lot of discussion about this. Wind industry often says wind energy is cheap. It's true that out of the Midwest, the projects have come in at pretty reasonable prices. That's definitely the case. But ridgeline wind projects are not very cheap for relatively small. The development costs are very high. The sites are difficult. Capacity factor is not so great. Here's the general trend of wind energy costs. What we saw was they did indeed come down a lot over the years. And this is not for ridgeline. Ridgeline projects are typically still up in this range. But for the industry as a whole, they came down. But they kind of stopped decreasing after about 2000. And I think at this point, we got down to about the level of the likely sort of minimum level of the technology. Wind requires tremendous amounts of cement and steel and copper, fiberglass, things that are very intrinsic to the physics of wind turbines. It's hard to get much better than that. You might be able to get a little better by tweaking the technology, making the rotors a little more efficient, but not too much. Then what happened was, due to, I think, large demand for cement and steel in China, commodity costs of those materials rose sharply, and the cost of wind energy actually rose in the next decade. Then the economic downturn happened and basically caused a lot of the wind industry to be shelved. Turbine prices have come down sharply since then, but not incredibly dramatically, and we're down to about where we were about 10 years ago. Solar costs, though, have done something a bit different. They've come down over the decades, come down pretty dramatically as well. Then the industry started to run out of silicon around 2005, 2006. They had to build their own silicon production facilities instead of just using the leftovers from the semiconductor industry. And then when they got overdone paying for that, and then with strong growth in Chinese production, the cost of solar has really ramped down as the scale of PV production has gone up. And I put in, this report from NREL has up to this point, and I put in the more recent data since then. You can buy modules now for under $1 a watt, which is amazing. That's a level I never thought I would see before 2015 or so. But there it is. And it still potentially could come down a lot more. So solar is really getting there. This is a cost comparison chart from the American Wind Energy Association, and it shows their cost comparisons. They've got photovoltaics down here, and they've got land-based wind here. The only problem with this cost range is it actually doesn't apply to the ridgeline wind projects. This is more of their lower cost projects. The real range of wind projects, and I put this here, so this is my addition. The actual range of ridgeline projects, as best we can tell from what we've heard about a few particular projects and what we can infer, is that it's somewhere in this range, 10 cents to 20 cents a kilowatt hour. And that's where PV is now, overlapping well with that. So we're actually getting down now for the first time in the range where photovoltaics can really compete with wind. And there's a hidden cost here. These costs do not include the cost of potentially a large amount of transmission development. But the Northeast grid is fairly congested. Our rural grids are not able to take a lot of large new wind projects. Both the Sheffield and the Lowell project actually have been curtailed significantly by the ISO because the system can't take a lot of the power much of the time. That's been in the news a little bit. We have information, though, from the ISO, for example, that it would cost somewhere upwards of about $10 billion to build the kind of transmission infrastructure that would be required to build that 5,000 megawatts of wind and bring in some of that hydropower. This comes from an article a couple years ago, actually 4 years ago now, but those costs have not changed. And I like to note that the guy who said this from the ISO, he has a terrible last name for a CEO. But I think his estimate's pretty good there. And it's fairly obvious, actually, to really get transmission significantly to lots of wind projects in the Northeast, you're going to need upwards of 4,000 miles of new transmission lines. And if you're paying a couple million a piece for those per mile, you get up into that 10 billion. If you put that in the wind cost equation, you basically double the cost of wind, and it's nowhere in the ballpark even. It's not even close to being economical. So I see solar as really much better from a cost standpoint. There's another thing with solar is we're still working right now with kind of an older technology, mostly crystal and silicon technology. That has kept pace pretty well. As it's scaled up, its cost has decreased a lot. But there's a huge amount of potential technological improvement for solar, potentially much cheaper materials and potentially much higher efficiencies that we're getting right now. And I think over time we're going to see that. The basic physics is there now. It's just a matter of bringing newer technologies to market. So my overall conclusion when I look at wind and solar in the region is there's really no justification for ridgeline wind, either from a resource or an economic or environmental point of view. And I'm pretty concerned, actually. I think as you'll hear more from the panel tonight, the system is pretty rigged up right now to push these kinds of projects through. Communities have very little say in siting of energy projects in Vermont under Section 248. The power industry is really afraid of solar power. Distributed solar power is a big threat to the bottom line. It sounds like conspiracy theory stuff, but it's true. They really love wind power in the Northeast because it gives them a chance to continue to dominate the electricity generation picture. So we're up against potentially a lot here. And this is my last content slide. I hope am I doing okay on time? All right, a little long. All right, I'll wrap it up. I study a lot more than just wind and solar. I look at heat pumps and hydro and solar hot water and other types of sources. And when I look at them all together, I see that there are a certain sort of grouping of sources that have very high potential for contributing to the energy supply, but very low impacts. I think that this is where we should be focusing. We should be focusing on photovoltaics, ground source and air source heat pumps, solar hot water, farm cellulosic biomass, concentrating solar power, if appropriately sited in the West. Midwest wind power, moderate impact, moderate potential relative to these. And other things make sense in Vermont too. Anaerobic digesters don't have a huge amount of potential, but they have low impact, and they're actually very negative impact. They're very good for farms, dairy farms. So this is kind of really potentially where we should be focusing. And I'll leave you with this nice picture at the end here.
All right.